Stephen Yates of the D.C. International Advisory, who was also the former advisor to former VP Dick Cheney. Stephen, so much today. It just is an ongoing drip of scandal.
Unfortunately, it's all bad news, yes.
Yeah. And something I want to ask you about, particularly with respect to the Department of Justice and the targeting of different media, because this, I believe, falls into your particular wheelhouse, where it concerns the security and of missions and keeping Americans safe. Because with the Associated Press and the Department of Justice, what Eric Holder had said in his testimony was that before Congress last week was that it was all based upon this report concerning a Yemen terror plot bust. And what we discovered was that the CIA was actually negotiating with the Associated Press, who had already been sitting on this story for several days. And the CIA just wanted the Associated Press to suppress it for one more day so that the following day the president could have his press conference and could say triumphantly that they foiled a terror plot bust. They didn't want to be scooped. That's not how this is supposed to go. And do you think, Stephen, that there was any real threat with either this or the basis that the DOJ is using for going after Jay Rosen and other Fox reporters?
No, I think this is a tremendous perversion of the system. I mean, the system is essentially supposed to protect those who seek information from the government. Is within their rights, whether there are individual citizens through Freedom of Information Act or other means, or journalists. It is the journalist's job to ask questions. It's a journalist's job to be inconvenient and hard to work around. The only people who are ever supposed to be subject to prosecution are those who took a sworn oath that would be violated by disclosure of information that they were sworn not to disclose. So, I mean, this is a tremendous perversion of the system. In terms of holding on to intelligence and trying to pressure journalists from publishing to allow for a victory lap, I mean, in all honesty, in more than 2 decades of dealing in national security affairs, I have never heard that even really alleged very often. I've heard of efforts, and I've been aware part of efforts to try to keep things from being disclosed when there are ongoing operations, when you're involved in a war, when there is a human operation involved in trying to influence an event abroad. But in all of these instances, we're talking about things that were in the past. And with James Rosen, that foundational report was about an allegation that the North Koreans might conduct another nuclear test, which was basically miles and miles from interesting or new information. Any idiot knew that. Exactly,
yeah, and Eric Holder suggesting that any sort of what makes it. By the way, Stephen, what would make that different from any other national security leak? Because isn't this the administration known for leaking its own information so that it can spin the news cycle?
No, I mean the bookends to pick up on this are them going to the mat and shredding the Bill of Rights in order to go after someone who may or may not have violated an oath, versus willful disclosure of the identity of a doctor who did lead to the capture and kill of bin Laden. So you have a very real human cost for a leak that they use for a victory lap. And then you have these basically harmless academic-like leaks. And then this whole notion of throwing out criminal conspiracy to the person on the receiving end of the leak, that was, I think, a perversion of the law. They knew they could not, under the law, get the information they sought by any other means. So someone lied.
It's not, and you've worked with the administration, you were with the Bush administration. It is not uncommon for reporters to try to solicit information for stories on their working. Do you think that is a criminal offense as the Department of Justice is trying to categorize it?
This has all of the appearances that they consider anyone asking for and seeking to obtain classified information as a criminal act. But this has always, with decades of precedent, this has always been considered something that's to be protected on the government side. You can go after a leaker, but not the receiver of a leak. Now, you recall back when Judith Miller went to jail because she refused to disclose a source. There are instances where the government can be quite aggressive. The difference here is they weren't going after, especially with James, they weren't going after his information to identify a leaker. They'd already identified the person they thought was the leaker. They were going after him for seeking the information.
Wow. And that seems, and this kind of goes along with, the administration has had a problem with this network from the Fox network from the get-go for this. In the case of the Associated Press, when they subpoenaed for those 20 phone lines, Eric Holder was saying that what they did risked or threw the security and safety of Americans into question. Even though it seems, though, Stephen, that any threats were already out of the way.
That's absolutely the case. The most forgiving interpretation of what he says is it's a stretch. Less forgiving interpretations would say it was a deception. And he also made a very pious pledge of allegiance to a shield law that he thought was very, very important to protect journalists in their pursuit of the truth. And Jay Carney, that lovable, honest Jay Carney's, telling us how much the president is a defender of the First Amendment, but they knew that they had already violated that very premise of a shield law in going after this James Rosen incident. And these are just the ones we know of now. This was a 2010 action. It's 2013 now, and the Fox network learned about it from the Washington Post.
Wow. And this is, I think it's safe to say we've passed through the looking glass, and this is, it's an all-out war on media, because this is something that I don't think that, and you gave a really good example, by the way, of that doctor who's imprisoned. He's imprisoned because he helped our country. He helped forces in Pakistan discover the whereabouts of bin Laden. He's in jail because, again, of a leak. And where has that been prosecuted?
I don't believe it has. And it's another example of when there are leaks that come out of this White House. Apparently, they have no problem with that, as long as it advances their cause. I mean, really, you have essentially Leninist control over the tools of government to suppress dissent and to deter anyone from challenging their version of the truth.
Wow. Just, well, we'll be watching all of this as it's unfold, but the press and free speech and a free press is definitely under attack. Stephen Yates with the DC International Advisory, DCIadvisory.org. Stephen, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.